Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the panel on teaching ethics in AI. My name is David Autor. I'm a Ford Professor of Economics in the Economics Department here. I'm a labor economist, so I'm not an AI expert, but I work a lot on the impacts of technology on employment, on wages, on skill demands, on inequality. And so I do think a lot of the, at least to my mind, a lot of the ethical questions also relate to what the technology is designed to do and what its repercussions will be for both workers and consumers. So I hope that perspective can be useful in the ensuing discussion. But my main role here is to introduce the four distinguished panelists. So I'm going to introduce them one at a time. They will each speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for a kind of 20 minutes of Q&A. So the first speaker will be Hal Abelson, who's the class of 1922 professor of electrical engineering and computer science at MIT. He has many awards and distinctions. He was designated as one of MIT's 6 inaugural Margaret McVicker Fellows, which is an award for teaching excellence in our undergraduate curriculum. He's been active in the 1970s in using computation as a conceptual framework for teaching, and his widely used textbook on computer science embodies the view that computer language is primarily a formal medium for expressing ideas about methodology, rather than simply a way to get computers to perform operations. So, please, Hal, we welcome your comments.
Thank you.
Oh, and here's the clicker.
Here's the clicker. Okay. So the adventure whose start we are celebrating today is really about MIT embracing the reality that computation is permeating everything we do, not only the technical, but as you heard the last time, the artistic and the social, and all of the opportunities and challenges that represents. And part of that is the way that our society and people making policy and people making the rules deal with those opportunities and challenges. And the thing I want to say today is that MIT can be a world leader in information policy. Not only do we have the opportunity to do that, but some people say MIT has the obligation to do that. We can be a world leader in information policy. There is an enormous need for that. If you look at the, almost 550 voting members of Congress, you see 9 of them with degrees in science, right? 3 in engineering. It's incredible when you think of the importance of this in society and the way that our government leaders are equipped to deal with that. So what does it take for MIT to do this? There are really 3 pillars of this. One is to do research, right? Take our top quality research and do some that is focused on real practical challenges of policy right now. And not only that, doing work together, engaged with people who are making policy to translate our insights and our ideas into things that can have a real impact on what's going on in industry and government right now. And the third is almost the first thing that President Reif said when he talked about this, is educating students, to use President Reif's words, bilingual. Educate bilingual leaders who have facility with both the social and policy and artistic side and the technical side. You saw some beautiful examples of that in the last panel where Michael Cuthbert talked about that, what he's doing in literature. So let me give examples of what this is, right? We can produce real insights into policy challenges and work with leaders. Let me give you an example. Just give you 2 examples of the kind of work we're doing. You've probably all heard about the controversies over surveillance. You probably remember the terrorist act in San Bernardino, which led the FBI to effectively demand that Apple build backdoors into its iPhones. One of the things that we did is we got together a bunch of leaders, technical leaders in cryptography and security, and wrote an analysis and a paper about why that is a bad idea. Why building in those back doors really undermines the security of the whole internet. And that paper that we did and went and spoke to a lot of people about it, got a lot of notice in Congress, got a lot of notice in the Senate hearings on that, and is still referenced in Congress. But of course, as you know right now, that's an active debate that's going on not only in Washington, but in lots and lots of countries. And we have the opportunity to bring our technical insight into that policy debate. Just to give you another example, you've all heard people talking about network neutrality. Well, Dave Clark, who's a senior research scientist at CSAIL and one of the real founders of the Internet protocols, worked with measurement places in the Internet and did some analysis, because one of the network neutrality issues is there enough capacity? Is there going to be congestion on the Internet? And Dave did some real analysis to show that the congestion not comes from the basic provision of how much capacity we have on the network, but basically where the switching and interfaces are noticed. And then he gave seminars on that in Washington, D.C. Again, it changes the way in which people are talking about this debate. Second pillar is active engagement with policy leaders. So these are some of the visitors we've had to MIT. The head of GCHQ, which is the United Kingdom analog of the NSA, the head of the US NSA, the Mass Attorney General, the head of the European Data Policy Society. And this is partly visiting, but partly really talking with these people about the issues and giving them some insight of what it looks like from a technology perspective to think about these issues. That's a second pillar of the way we can be engaged at MIT. And then third, there's the interaction with how do you educate these bilingual students? There are programs MIT ought to be considering about how you really do that kind of thing. One of the ones that we're doing right now is a joint course with the Georgetown University Law School. And what's happening is we have combined MIT law school teams where the project is to take some area like facial recognition, for which there's a lot of interest and a lot of thought, and for the teams to work together to create model legislation for dealing with these issues. And the critical thing is that you have the MIT students and the law school students actually working together to solve some problem. And what they learn is that there are people who have different modes of thinking that bring different insights and different kinds of intuitions that they don't have. And that's absolutely critical in thinking about how you educate these bilingual communities. One of the things that comes out of that is not only, let's call term papers, but these things have actually led to published research. So you're seeing real research and publications that come out of this work that's part of leadership. And then that leadership is not only about our faculty and our researchers and everyone else, but it's also our students. Let me just give you two examples of that. This goes back to 2007, and what you're seeing is the discovery that you can predict people's sexual orientation by looking at the sexual orientation of their Facebook friends. So over on the right, if you look at male homosexuals, you can predict that facial orientation by looking at their facial friends, and you're seeing different populations, like female straight and female homosexuals. And David called me last night, and he said, what do you mean that was a breakthrough result? Everyone knows it. Well, you know what? In 2019, everybody knows that. This is work that was done in 2007 by MIT undergraduates, and it was a breakthrough result. It really was. People didn't know that thing then. And why is it important? Because, for example, we talk about privacy and personal information. That observation completely upends the way we think about privacy. Because, for example, if I am gay and I choose to out myself, that gives a tremendous amount of information about my friends. So we have an outdated view of privacy. The regulatory structure has not begun to cope with that. And let me end with one more that's even more famous. It is almost impossible today to be talking about bias on the internet without a reference to Joy Buolamwini's master's thesis in her work, where what she did, starting 4 or 5 years ago, was documenting that facial recognition programs are much, much less accurate on females than they are on males, and much, much less accurate on dark-skinned people than on light-skinned people. And then when you do the intersection, and you talk about, do these programs work on dark-skinned females, there's enormous problems in that technology that's rolling out. There was actually a bit of a controversy in Joy's work getting published and Amazon objecting to it last month. But the point I'm making is that was a master's thesis that was started in 2005. And that now has become the common currency, the leadership by which people are talking to. So it's not only our faculty and it's not only our scientists, we have the opportunity even to make our students real leaders in doing significant work. So just to cap up, we can do policy leadership. It requires policy-relevant research, it requires active engagement, and it requires really taking seriously that our students can become this bilingual community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hal. That was inspiring. So I want to introduce now Barbara Grosz, who is the Higgins Professor of Natural Sciences in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Harvard University. She has made groundbreaking breakthroughs in natural language processing, and importantly as well, she co-founded Harvard's Embedded Ethics program, which integrates teaching of ethics and ethics reasoning into core computer science classes. And so she is going to discuss the importance of considering ethics from the start in the design of computer sciences, a computer science curriculum, and describe how we can go about doing that.
Thank you, David. Do we have the first slide? Oh, I have to. No. Let's go back. There we go. Okay, so my title tells you where I'm gonna wind up at the end of my 10 minutes. I want to start by talking about how we got there, and I'll start that with interesting. There we go. Okay. How I got started and interested in ethics. So I should say first that I went to Cornell as an undergraduate, and I use as much of the philosophy and history of art I took there as I do of the mathematics. So just a reflection on the last panel. So I began hearing from friends when the voice personal assistants on phones came out, people who were interested in why they did what they did and why they failed where they failed, and I noticed something really important. You would think a phone personal assistant that could answer one of these questions could answer all of them. This particular sequence is from a class I started teaching in 2015, Intelligent Systems, Design and Ethical Challenges. Turns out that systems can answer the first question. You'll notice that the answer to the second question seems a bit odd. The system seems confused about a flu shot being a particular kind of business, like, you get hammers at hardware stores, or it's a musical group. I didn't figure this out. A student had to explain it to me. But even more pressing, if you ask where to get a sprained ankle treated, it tells you which web page will tell you how to treat it, which might seem funny for a sprained ankle, but if it were a stroke, it could be a matter of life and death. So I thought it was important for our students to begin to learn about the ethical consequences of the products that they make. And the first fall that I taught this course, the cover, I think this was in October, the cover of the New York Times Magazine talked about the Barbie doll that was available and announced itself as your daughter's best friend. You'll notice, and this is right out of the New York Times, so I was very lucky. It became part of, so that what you just saw was the first assignment in class. This was part of the second assignment, which was, for this and a few other examples, to write an argument about whether this product should have been made or not. Now, you'll notice here that the system, the Barbie doll, doesn't understand the word nothing. That's kind of true of most language systems. They don't do so well on negatives. Doesn't understand the negative behind destroyed, and doesn't really understand anything about dialogue being a collaborative behavior. The kid at this point throws it away. So here's the problem. This isn't just funny. It raises an ethical challenge. This is a toy for 3 to 8-year-olds that's teaching kids that you don't have to listen what somebody is saying to you, that you just follow your own script. So I studied, as David hinted at, I studied a lot of natural language dialogue. People, adults, don't follow scripts. You know this from the customer care people you interact with. 4-year-olds, they really don't. So something's wrong here, and I taught this class on intelligent systems design and ethical challenges. And then I realized something. In my research on collaboration and teamwork, I argued that it was really important to design collaboration into systems from the beginning. And it turns out it's really important to think about ethics from the beginning of system design as well. And that is what led me to the segue from this course on that was really AI and ethics into thinking we needed ethics throughout the computer science curriculum. So that students would think about designing systems not just that were efficient or had all of the properties that Aaron talked about in the last panel, but also had considered some of the ethical consequences of what the design did. And some people are now talking, in the AI world, are talking about building systems that can do ethical reasoning. That would be great, but we still can't really do reasoning about the physical world well enough. And if you spend any time with philosophical ethics, or even with policy, you see how hard it is. So it's a little hard to automate what we really don't know how to do. And that's fundamentally because there are values and tastes at the base of this, that it takes argument to deal with this. So I'm advocating that rather than trying to build systems that do the reasoning now, we teach our students to do the reasoning. I also have advocated in other settings that it's important for industry to make this a priority, but that's another talk. So here's an example from my class that really motivated this need to integrate throughout the curriculum. And I'm going to let you read. This is, so in the Intelligent Systems Design and Ethical Challenges class, every class session has the students involved in some activity. On a Tuesday, the class was Tuesday, Thursday. On Tuesday, we had a long discussion about the Facebook emotion contagion experiment and the need for people, even in industry, who are not required to do IRBs, to think about what they're doing when they have human subjects. This is a class, 140 students compete to get into 24 slots. They have to write essays about why they want to be in the class, what they'll contribute, what they'll take away. So they're committed. Okay, the assignment, the activity has them planning something for a social network company, and it includes in it asking them to list the data they would collect on their users. Okay, this is 48 hours after the Facebook emotion contagion experiment. I go to the board and I start writing down what data they want to collect. And it's good I'm looking at the board so they don't see that I don't have a straight face. And I turn around and I say, how many of you thought about ethics in coming up with this list? None of them. I ask on the assignment why. because we know we're supposed to make money for a company and write efficient code and beautiful code, but nobody tells us we have to think about ethics. So they care about it, but it's not in front of their faces. It's somewhat like implicit bias in hiring decisions. It's cognitively not present. The idea of embedded ethics is that we should have ethics throughout the computer science curriculum so that students learn about thinking about the ethical consequences of their designs at the same time that they're learning about efficient code, correct code, elegant code. What's up here is the list of 14 of the courses that we have integrated this in. This semester, we're doing 12 courses. We grew from 4 courses to 12. So one of the things I advise people who want to do this is start small, build up a consensus, and then get bigger. In order to do this, you need philosophers brave enough to tackle technology and computer scientists interested and brave enough to tackle philosophy. The way this works is that we have graduate students in philosophy, advanced graduate students who have a reputation for good teaching, work with faculty to identify a technical topic in the course that raises an ethical issue. They then design a class session around that, including philosophical readings and an assignment. The class has an activity it's very important for students to engage in using the ideas that they get. The assignment's crucial, so students know it's serious. It's important. Why do we have philosophers? Well, it turns out they have a lot of expertise in ethics, and they also understand that such notions as justice and fairness are social constructs, and you can't simply define them in a way that's mathematically pleasing. You need to you need to think about values, you need to think about choices among values, and so on. I want to just end by saying, I usually argue that to be truly smart, a system has to be designed with people in mind, and that's one of the changes between 1950 and now. Teamwork is needed everywhere, and ethics is everybody's responsibility. I would like to see all of us in computer science pulling together as opposed to breaking apart. I'll just end by saying the students really like this. The faculty are wildly enthusiastic. They've started to learn ethics themselves, which pleases them no end. And it's now spreading over into how they think about research, both students and faculty.
Thank you very much. And fittingly enough, our next speaker is a philosopher. David Danks is the L.L. Thurstone Professor of Philosophy and Psychology and the head of the Department of Philosophy at Carnegie Mellon University at CMU. He integrates ideas from philosophy, AI, and policy into his work, and he studies the policy impacts of artificial intelligence and robotics. And let me also say, I didn't realize philosophers could be so young. I thought you had to be, I thought you had to be, at least in your 60s to be a philosopher. So very impressed by this as well. So thanks very much for your comments.
Thanks. I'm not nearly as young as I look. I age rapidly now that I'm the head of a department of philosophy. If you ever want to think about what herding cats really looks like, try and get a bunch of philosophers to agree on something. This actually follows, I think, really nicely on what Barbara was saying. And not just because I endorse the idea of a jobs program for philosophers by having ethics everywhere, but also because I think we need to broaden the way that we think about ethics. Sometimes I think people think about ethics as the domain of folks like Kant, Aristotle, John Rawls from just up the road. And instead, I think we need to think about ethics more in a kind of big tent way. Ethics is about how you ought to act in order to realize your values. And if we take that broader view, let's see if I can, all right, there we go. One of the first things you quickly realize if we have a somewhat broader view of the nature of ethics is that there's a complete spectrum of ethical challenges. Some of them are really easy ethical challenges. You shouldn't steal from people. Now, you might think, how is that an ethical challenge? Of course I shouldn't steal from people. but it's absolutely something that is about how you ought to act to realize your values in the world. Now, you don't have to take a fancy philosophy class for it. You don't need the language of deontology or consequentialism or any of these sorts of things. All you need to have is what a colleague of mine refers to as grandmother ethics, the ethics that your grandmother would have taught you. On the other end of the extreme, at the other end of the spectrum, we have the truly difficult ethical conundrums where there's really no answer that is going to be satisfactory to everybody, and where you do need these very complex frameworks in order to think through them. Now, one of the things that I think comes up a lot in technology is that the challenges we face in technology are somewhere in the middle. So this is the one I personally am quite fond of talking about, which is when we think about autonomous vehicles, the ethical challenge of whether the vehicle should follow the speed limit in all cases or should minimize the probability of an accident. Now, those are both values that I would conjecture everyone in this room endorses, and you can't have both all the time. Sometimes the safest thing to do is to go faster than the speed limit. Now, the technology doesn't tell you how to resolve that trade-off. The technology doesn't care. The cars that are being developed in Pittsburgh by Uber and Aurora and Argo and those companies, they don't care whether they always follow the speed limit or they always drive to minimize the probability of an accident. That is a human choice that actually goes and shows up in design and development. It doesn't show up after the fact. It's not an ethical module that we plug in afterwards. But it's rather something that if you want to get the vehicle to drive one block, you'd better figure out how to reconcile these, it turns out, conflicting values. Now, in order to really tackle these kinds of ethical challenges, I want to suggest we need to really do three different kinds of operations. The first is we need to know what kinds of questions we should be asking. So a second is how do we answer those questions about trade-offs, about the ethical constraints we have. And then third, what should we do with those answers? That's the how ought we act to realize our values. And these are questions that you can do on the research side. We're actually at CMU engaged in some projects with the private sector, trying to teach frontline coders how to ask the right questions. So we're not trying to teach them how to answer the questions. We just want to get them to ask questions before they were implemented in code. But what we're also doing is trying to realize this in our educational programs. And you quickly see, and those of you who are here for Farnham's talk this morning may recognize these overlapping circles. They seem to show up a lot. This idea that there are many different disciplines that we have to put together. We now have over a dozen classes at CMU that explicitly adopt this kind of multidisciplinary approach to identifying the questions to ask, the answers to the questions, and what those answers imply in terms of action and policy. And another about dozen classes that are implicitly using this. They aren't necessarily explicitly talking to the students about the multidisciplinary kind of approaches, but they're absolutely doing it, whether it's a databases class that now has a week on implicit bias and algorithmic biases, for example. And so I wanted to do, in the remaining half of my time here, is just briefly talk about one of the classes, one I know very well personally, which is called AI, Society, and Humanity. Which is a course that is offered in the philosophy department and in the public policy school jointly at Carnegie Mellon, and aims to sort of realize this vision of trying to have students who are able to bring together the insights from all of these different disciplines. Now, the problem that we realized very quickly on when we were trying to design the course is inevitably we're going to have to do collaboration. There's no way, there are very few people in the world who can bring the insights of all those different disciplines to bear at once. And to the best of my knowledge, none of them are 18 years old. Typically, it takes 18 to 20 years of professional experience to be able to do this. And we're dealing with people who, many of whom have 18 to 20 years of life under their belt, as opposed to training. And so we found that there are a number of sort of specific issues. There's a lack of relevant knowledge. The computer sciences students don't know very much philosophy. The philosophers don't know very much computer science at the end of the day. And so what we've done is structure things around trying to create multidisciplinary collaborations. Now, the problem is if you do that, the students are coming from different disciplinary backgrounds. Every discipline has its own set of questions that they ask. If you show a technology to a computer scientist, a psychologist, an economist, a philosopher, and ask them, what's the most important question we should be asking about this technology? You will get not 4 different answers, you'll get about 12 different answers. because different disciplines just ask different kinds of questions about the world. So we have realized that in the class we have to foreground that issue. We have to be very explicit about defining disciplinary approaches in terms of the questions they ask, which is strange to the students. The students think about disciplines in terms of the methods that are used. And so what we're trying to do is get them to step even one stage back and understand that it's different questions that often define different disciplines, not just the different methods. And of course, finally, this has come up earlier, this notion of bilingualism. Our students are, as I suspect most undergraduates are, largely monolingual in the sense that they know how to talk computer science, they know how to talk philosopher, they know how to talk sociology. And words are used in very different ways in the different disciplines. When a computer scientist talks about a loss function, they simply mean the thing that is optimized against in the learning of some algorithm. When a philosopher and ethicist talks about a loss function, they have something very different in mind. They have in mind the actual harms that accrue to somebody because of a policy or actions that are implemented. And so again, much as with foregrounding the issue of different questions, we have to foreground the issue of terminological differences. How is it that the very same words, the same chirps and whistles or sequences of characters, can be used in such radically different ways in the different disciplines? And making sure that the students start to become a little bit more multilingual over the course of the class. So what that resulted in was a class in which the final projects, what we geared the students towards, were small group analyses of a current or near future technology that required them to bring multiple perspectives, multiple disciplinary perspectives to bear as part of that analysis. The part the students all really hated at the outset and loved at the end is they did not get to pick their groups. We assigned them to groups, deliberately forcing them to interact with students from other majors. Now, part of the way we were able to do that is this was a first-time class taught in philosophy. I didn't ask Augustine what it is here at MIT. At Carnegie Mellon, that usually means you'll get 10 to 12 kids in the class. We had 60, coming from 14 different majors, coming from 6 of the 7 different colleges. The only college that wasn't represented was the business school, which is graduate only. It's a little bit unfortunate that none of the MBAs came over to take this class. We're going to try and remedy that next fall. And so we did have the disciplinary diversity that we were able to pair the students together into these groups. And they studied everything from, as you can see, AI doctors to Google duplex to autonomous weapons. And had to do the hard work of actually understanding the technology, but there was a technologist in every group, and bringing to bear notions from design and ethics and the humanities, but there was a humanities student in almost every group, and integrating that together with insights from the social sciences, but there was a social science major in almost every group. And so the students really had to learn how to do this. So what did we get out of this? What are the sort of morals that we had as a takeaway, besides the fact that teaching a first-time project-based course with 60 students is not a good idea? I'm jealous that you only have 24. Yeah, yeah. That's the problem with being young. You make dumb decisions sometimes. So what are the key morals that we took away from it? The first is to focus on consumption, not production, outside of one's major. I think sometimes there's this drive to turn computer scientists into ethicists and ethicists into computer scientists. And that's great when you can do it, but it's also a bar that we don't necessarily have to reach. The ability to consume the products of another discipline is all that's required for collaboration. And that's a much lower bar. And it's the sort of thing that is actually achievable even just in one semester. The second is that you have to explicitly teach the disciplinary patterns. You don't get to just count on the students knowing what they are. And of course, you have to teach collaboration. We often throw our students into collaborative teams and say, go do something great. And the students flounder, but they don't want to say anything because that would admit weakness. And so we've also realized we have to explicitly teach these kinds of collaborative skills. So I think those are hopefully morals that might help with some of the efforts that I'm sure are underway here at MIT. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was terrific. So I just wanted to finally introduce Solon Barocas, who is a researcher at the Microsoft lab, Microsoft Research in New York City, as well as an assistant professor in the Department of Information Science at Cornell University, and he works on ethical and policy implications of artificial intelligence. He is also the co-founder of the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in Machine Learning section, and later set that up at the ACM as well. So we're privileged to have him speak to us today.
Hi, everyone. Let's see if I got this right. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to say that it's very heartening, encouraging to have been someone in the past few years working on these type of topics and see an institution like MIT devote itself so explicitly, so fully to a new college that is concerned with these kinds of societal questions, these basic ethical questions. And I really do hope there's an opportunity here to integrate ethics and policy questions into the foundations of computing. And rather than kind of repeating some of the things that my august colleagues have discussed already, I'll be trying to focus a little bit on what is the substance and scope of ethics in computing. What do we actually care about? And how might we actually think about the relevant ways to approach those issues? So rather than asking questions about, for instance, how to structure the way we teach it, should we teach this as an integrated way, which I think generally we all agree would be preferable, rather than maybe these one-off classes, I'm going to be asking sort of what is the orientation we take even when we design it in these different ways. And some of this will come from work that I'm undertaking with some colleagues at Cornell, at Berkeley, and University of Washington, based on an NSF grant through its culture, it's the Cultivating Cultures of Ethics in STEM. And this work, at least on the Cornell side, is devoted to trying to do a kind of survey of the state of ethics teaching within computer science. So how is it that people are actually teaching these things? It's an empirical question that we're trying to answer. We've done some preliminary work, and some of the things I'll describe here grows out of that preliminary work, but we're in the process of developing a sample frame, and we'll do a kind of attempt to have a kind of statement in a year or two about how people are actually going about this in practice. Okay, so, oh, very nice. Okay, so what I'll try to describe is by no means an exhaustive list of the ways we might think about the way to approach teaching ethics in computing, but I think sort of describes what can be a quite diverse set of orientations that actually really mean quite different things for what we're going to be training our students in. And so one example to begin, and this will be a list of about, I think, five or six entries, is something like professional responsibility. And in a way, this is most analogous to what we have already in many other engineering fields, it's even in law and science and other things like medicine, where there's a sort of expectation of like basic expectations of what you're going to be doing as a responsible, a decent person in this vocation. And in certain engineering fields, this obviously takes the form of explicit expectations around things like you don't build buildings that are going to fall down, you are not disloyal or dishonest to your clients, you make sure that you are going to specify the conditions under which this artifact is going to work, and so on. But I think the relevant dimension here, too, is that these are also things that figure into licenses. A kind of condition of being in the profession is that you abide by these things. And so there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not computer science as a field should not only learn from these adjacent disciplines where people actually have a license or sort of as a condition of being in that profession have to abide by these rules, but whether we actually should have things where, like, if you fail to abide by these responsibilities, that somehow this license can be revoked. And so there are interesting conversations around whether things like the ACM Code of Ethics should itself become something that's not just meant to be sort of generic guidance for people in computing, but become something more of a kind of condition of entry, right? You're not actually able to be a computer scientist unless you meet the expectations that this code lays out. This is in contrast to some of the things we've already discussed, I think, which is sort of approaching this as a matter of research ethics. And I think this has become a very pressing problem in the sense that increasingly the kinds of things we're doing with computational tools is actually studying humans. So no longer is this sort of computing in isolation from humans, but we're actually building artifacts that directly interact with people. We're often using data about people. And so things that we're seeing as sort of purely technical projects, increasingly now we're seeing as things that directly impact human subjects. And obvious examples of this include studying the kind of data we now produce when we use all sorts of digitally mediated platforms. What's interesting about this approach is that while there's a lot to learn, and it's important that computer scientists increasingly recognize that they are engaged in human subjects research, the expectation here is that you be ethical with respect to your research subjects, in the sense that you have obligations to those people who are involved in the research that you're undertaking. Notably, though, this is not a way of thinking about your broader impact to society. The principles we have in research ethics are not the principles that say, don't conduct this research because of its impact. It's a principle that helps us understand how to be faithful in our obligations to research subjects, the people directly involved in our studies. And so while these are important principles, they don't necessarily take us as far as we might want. A different thing that's happened, and I think I've been involved in some of this work, is for normative issues to simply become questions of technical research. So just like security and privacy are now firmly embedded in computer science as technical topics, the past few years has seen questions of fairness become yet another normative issue that is sort of seen increasingly as just a technical issue that we can work on. And I can say from practice, from my own experience in teaching these topics, this has been very compelling. No longer are normative issues things that have to be taught to you by philosophers. Instead, they are actually something that you can think about in purely technical terms, and you can make your own kind of contributions rather than having to see this as something that you'll be educated in by someone outside the field. And I think this obviously has lots of opportunities. By making these into technical problems, they become tractable, they become something that can be pursued, I think, very effectively in practice in an industry, but potentially they also make things much more narrow. And so what is sort of amenable to sort of obvious computational thinking ends up being the things we work on, which might be quite different than what philosophy and other areas would want us to think about. And we heard at the start about this idea that computing itself can also inform law and policy, and I think there's a complement to that, which is that we can also obviously train computer science students in that law and policy. So in order to be able to contribute to law and policy, they obviously have to understand the relevant law and policy. And here this can take a couple different forms. It can be of the style where we actually want people to understand the fundamental normative commitment and principles that are kind of embedded in the law and policy that we have. So not just teaching people how to abide by the law, but understanding why those laws exist at all and what they are trying to achieve, and then how that actually might structure their work as computer scientists. And I would say that this is sort of in contrast to things where we might actually just instead want to make sure that we're sending people off into the world where they know how to comply with those regulations. So there's certainly a kind of style of education which is about making sure that people actually know how to behave under the rules, rather than necessarily helping them think about the higher level principles that the law and policy might be focused on. And here, this might even take a kind of technical form as well, where a lot of the tools that we've now developed to try to realize certain policy goals are themselves actually difficult to use. So an example of this might be something like differential privacy, a very powerful tool to sort of guarantee certain promises for anonymity, but at the same time, something that you can't necessarily use very effectively without appropriate training. And so here you can imagine education being not a matter of teaching differential privacy as a research question, but rather teaching it as something that you need to know something about in order to use it effectively in practice. Okay, and then the final thing I'll point out is that, of course, there's also a style of education here that is not even focused on individual decision makers, where the goal isn't to sort of ensure that the students we send off into the world might be able to make good decisions for themselves, but instead to help people understand how computing sits in relation to other structures, institutional structures in society. And I think this is actually critical because often, I think, in the framework of ethics, we can see it often as a matter of individual choice, when many of the issues that our students are going to confront when they go off to these jobs are ones in which individual choice will matter, but where structural considerations are going to be incredibly significant. Basic things like the market, the demand to meet the expectations of your shareholders, the political context, the historical context, these things will often shape the direction that computing takes in ways that are not so easily addressed by the individual decisions that our students might make, no matter the ethical training they might receive. And so I think the point of trying to provide this kind of survey is to show that there's really quite a bit of disagreement about what we're even trying to accomplish when we say that we're going to be teaching ethics in computing. And we can draw on many different types of traditions and orientations to realize different goals. But I think the challenge for the future is to be able to think about what comes, what are the kind of benefits and disadvantages of these different approaches, how to integrate them in ways that try to get the most out of the ones which are relevant, and maybe try to sidestep some of the limitations of others. And here I think the hope, anyway, is that we can learn from each other. And the goal of this empirical project is not just to be able to make a kind of descriptive statement about the way people are teaching, but to give a sense of what seems to be working well, what is the kind of wide diversity of approaches that people have developed, such that we can actually learn from the kind of experimentation that's happening at this early stage in the field. So thanks very much.
Okay, so now we're gonna take questions from the audience. And so if you have a question, please raise your hand. We walk around with microphones, and please I will try to direct the question to the panel to make sure everyone has an opportunity to express their thoughts.
Good morning. Professor Grosz and several of the others stressed the benefits of integrating ethics into a computer science curriculum, and I'm curious whether there is either A, data, or B, case studies that educate us on that. That is to say, where we're teaching of ethics has been done in one fashion, in one area, it's been in another fashion, another area, and we can see a difference of outcome. So obviously there's some history in medicine and other parts of science, so any insights on that?
Please go ahead, Professor Grosz.
So I just want to highlight how important that question is and stress that one of the big challenges here is that we're not testing just what happens in an individual course. What we'd like to see is what the impact is over the long term. So, for example, in the Intelligent Systems Design and Ethical Challenges course, one of my favorite remarks on the student evaluation at the end was, now I understand what I would think is right and how I might persuade my manager to change what my project is. And that's really what we're trying to do. And it's an open research question how you can measure 3 and 5 years down the pike what the impact has been. I also want to say I think it's a both and or all and process. The kind of course that this David talked about is really important and gives depth that's different from the depth that you get when you have this pervasiveness, but I think the pervasiveness is really important to habituate students to thinking about it. There are studies that show in other contexts that just a one-off course, whether it's a required computer science and ethics or an optional one, don't really work because they make the ethics seem like it's an afterthought. So you can have these rich courses, but the reason we went the pervasive route is we think it's important to make this part of what students think about all of the time. So it's the bottom line answer is it's still an open question as far as I know.
David, Solon, either of you want to contribute?
Just to echo that, I mean, there is a lot of work on, as Barbara said, in other disciplines. So especially in engineering ethics, it's pretty robust that you have to have it integrated into the curriculum to get anything more than about a 1-semester change in behavior. I will say one of the other things that we're trying to do is not keep it restricted to the academy. So trying to find outreach and engagement, both professional education, executive education, but also these kinds of interventions in companies to help breed and cultivate exactly the sort of pervasiveness of the issues of asking questions about values and interests at every stage in a process.
Excellent. Next question, please. Yes.
My name is Jeff Young. I'm a reporter for Ashford. We cover education and technology. And there's been an interesting debate. I mean, because this is so structural, as several of you have pointed out, and now the stakes are so much higher for the kind of questions being talked about today compared to like 10 years ago. The one complaint that I'm hearing is that even the sources of funding for this kind of research, and even people have raised questions with the sources of the funding of the Schwarzschild College itself, is how do you address the fact that even, how does someone behave ethically when those larger structures are, when the funding sources are going to point maybe in one direction or another, and how do you create a system where you can insulate yourself from that, even in a place like MIT, as colleges around the country are, have to deal less with public support and more with funding private funding.
Hal, would you like to respond to that one?
Well, I don't know about the immediate short-term answer, but in terms of what's practical and what's important, either to government or industry funding, you couldn't possibly overemphasize the importance of putting this in their education. So if you look at a company like Google, from the most practical way you could possibly imagine. One of Google's issues is, do people trust its products? And that's real dollars and cents in the strongest way you could possibly say. And they're starting to recognize that the way you do that is that their employees are trained in exactly the kinds of things that the two panelists on the left I've been talking about. So they're coming along. I don't think there's going to be a long-term funding problem in this. It's as practical as anything else in computer science.
Solon, yeah.
Yeah, this is a really important question. And I think maybe I would parse it in two different ways. I think one is sort of the independence of the institution itself, meaning academic institutions increasingly are reliant on sources of funding besides the state. And they're interesting and important questions to ask how that might be affecting how we teach and what we teach. But there's also a question about an orientation toward teaching ethics which stresses individual responsibility that sort of is in the face of what continues to be profound structural reasons why the tech industry might move in a certain direction. And I think we need to sort of grapple with both of those problems. And my sense is that we haven't yet really thought nearly enough about what kind of education we would want to give people to become more reflexive, not just about their own behavior, but about the particular conditions which explain why the tech industry often moves in a certain direction. And that may even involve sort of suggesting to people that they want to pursue completely different occupations, or there's other ways to actually engage in the world to affect structural change that are not about necessarily being a frontline engineer who has ethical commitments that they intend to realize, but actually want to occupy a different position, maybe do more direct political advocacy. And again, I think there's an important question to ask: how do we train those people, or is it even appropriate to imagine that computer science departments are the place where people are being trained to do that kind of work?
Great.
Okay.
Okay, sure.
So
Please go ahead.
I'm going to try not to antagonize everybody, but
Could
so
you
when
introduce
David said-
yourself as well, please?
What's that?
Could you please introduce yourself as well?
Oh, Mike Spessner. You gave stealing as an example of something that everybody would agree with, but of course that's not really true. I mean, like Robin Hood or Elizabeth Warren believe in stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Donald Trump believes in stealing from everybody as long as it aggrandizes himself. China believes in stealing intellectual property. In fact, they don't really believe that intellectual property should be an entity that could be stolen. I think Richard Stallman probably thinks the same way. But it seems to me that nobody really has, the idea of ethical training would be to look at the largest consequences of what you're doing, if you can, and you can't really predict that, but you can try, and then take your own moral ideas and what's good and what's not good and apply that. But I think the hard part is figuring out what these global consequences are. So what would you say about that?
Okay, Barbara, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, and I'm going to wrap up my answer with an answer also to the previous question. So first, academia has a really important role to play here if it holds on to its values of open publishing and also if we in computer science hold on to open source. I take heart from what's happened. I saw the whole cognitive science revolution. I think by starting with undergraduates and graduate students, we create different kinds of people going in the world. More directly to your question, and this goes back to Solon's answer, we need to have the way to do, so first of all, one of the things we make clear to students is that there isn't always a single right answer because there are values that may conflict, that they need to have a discussion. If you talk, I just had a conversation yesterday with a justice on the California Supreme Court who's interested in AI, and he said, at some point it comes down to us arguing values. It's not just data that we process, even though it's nice to have the processed data. We need to have a conversation in this country and in the world that brings people in industry, academics from the social sciences as well as from philosophy and ethics, and computer scientists together, and government, and we as citizens. I mean, the citizenry has to take responsibility as well. So that's not going to get resolved by computer science alone. But I, again, have optimism that if we teach our students how to have those conversations and how to talk about the ethical issues, not just in terms of it doesn't feel right, but even to understand why you don't steal, when you then might understand when maybe it's okay. And I think that also reflects on regulations. If you understand why there's a regulation or why there's a policy, you're more likely to follow it, or if you think it's mistaken, to try to change it rather than to just subvert it.
Okay. Yes. Question from Brandi Davis.
Brandi Davis, I'm professor of computer science here and artificial intelligence. I was very struck by Solon's comments, and I think we need a term for, where you were talking about how if you look at an issue like fairness from the perspective of an engineer, you may get a narrowing of perspective. I think that's terribly important. It also has to be balanced out against what I think is a very useful consequence of that, which is every time I've talked to somebody who's upset about fairness, it's very hard to get them to tell me what they think fair actually means. What would be a fair outcome? And you find out there's an enormous amount of fog there. So maybe this is just a comment endorsing the whole mindset here, but to the extent that we can put those two perspectives together, that would be wonderful. We also need a term for what you're talking about, the engineeringization of ethics, where you get too narrow a view. It'd be interesting to be able to name it.
David, would you like to comment on that?
I just want to quickly say, I think that's yet another reason that we need to be doing this in a multidisciplinary way. Fairness has a couple thousand years of, I don't mean this to impugn what you just said. I've been at conferences where people say, I wonder what the nature of agency is. It would be great if somebody thought about that. And as a philosopher, you sit there and think, hi, we've been doing this for a few thousand years now. It doesn't mean we've got the right answers, but we've at least got frameworks for how to think about and talk about some of these things that I agree, the real power comes when we then merge that with the unbelievable tools that have come out of engineering, computer science, AI.
Just a quick comment that maybe one of the most important things we do is teach students to talk across disciplines and backgrounds, because it's those conversations that are going to have to happen broadly in the public for us to resolve these issues.
Great. Go ahead.
Nicholas Ashford from MIT. In one sense, this is just a subset of a lot of things we've asked about in any deployment of science technology. And let me argue that it provides guidance for both personal and institutional behavior, which forces us to ask, is the goal of the activity being met? Is it efficient, which is an economic question? And is it fair? And John Rawls was mentioned, and there's a distinct difference between utilitarian ethics and what John Rawls talks about. But there's a second issue which really becomes extraordinarily important, and that is, are we working on the right problem? The easiest thing to do is, with the expanded computational facility, statistics, algorithms, is to do more information creation and much less critical thinking. What does the information tell us? Is it the right question? And I would say there is a deficit in asking, why are you trying to get this information? What use is it? And are you taking efforts away from asking the more important questions about what the information gives you? I see that that's missing.
Okay. Hal, do you want to, are we asking the right questions, and how do we teach people to focus on the right questions?
Gosh, I don't even know where to start. I think that's terribly difficult. And I think, one of the things we're involved with MIT is saying, what should our curriculum look like? How should it be changed specifically to address the kind of issues that you're talking about? And I don't know what the answers are going to come out to be, but what your perspective you're doing is just incredibly important. So I don't know the answers, but at least we're starting with the questions.
Barbara, want to?
One
as well?
quick response. One of the things we aim to teach students is to ask not only, could I build this, which is what we've tended to ask in computing, like, wow, it actually works, but should I build it, and should I build it the way I'm building it? And of course, you have the same question in law, when you have to think about not just what the law does and is intended to do, but the unintended consequences.
Great. We have time for one more question.
So I wanted to go back to this comment about stealing and maybe raise a razor issue. I wouldn't describe Elizabeth Warren's desire to tax people as stealing. But that did remind me that there are sub-communities in very, very underprivileged places of the world, or underprivileged people in communities where they do actually think stealing is okay. And I guess generally I should raise the issue of what's okay to do and what's not okay is super cultural, and different sub-communities view different things as okay. And just in case this needs convincing, presumably you all feel a difference between speeding and driving across a red light. Why? They post traffic laws, but somehow we know that one is okay and everyone does that, and if you get penalized, it's whatever. And the other one is a law that, no, you don't. You just don't cross on a red light, at least not, maybe in Boston you do, but most of the world you do not.
I thought I had the order reversed here. I thought.
And different cultures, different communities, the very underprivileged in different countries view this differently. And I wonder how, in your teaching of ethics, how does this virtual cultures or different cultures can come in?
So in a couple of different ways. So one is to emphasize asking questions about why are we doing certain things, what are we trying to achieve, who is being served by this, whose interests and goals are being served. Because as you said, one of the quick things that you come to realize is how much technology serves the interests and values of only a subset of the population. I'm sure you have those issues in Boston as much as we have them in Pittsburgh. And a second thing to do is to recognize the role of policy in this. When you live in a society that exhibits value pluralism, to use the jargony term, that's what government's about. That's what political philosophy at its heart, much of it is about. How do you have a legitimate government that actually is able to be responsive when not everyone agrees about what we ought to do? And so bringing in these policy questions, the policy debates, how do we get the regulation that will advance the common good, whatever that might be? How do we even figure out what the common good is? Simply getting students to ask these questions who are coming, to be frank, particularly from the technical fields, just getting them to ask the questions opens up a whole new set of conversations that these students, I find, are very willing to then engage in and learn how to engage in them in a constructive way.
Okay, well, that's a terrific answer. Any final words from any panelists? Otherwise, I'm going to set you